Welcome to My Private Professor's Innovation Education Spotlight, where we highlight forward-thinking leaders who inspire and empower others to achieve their potential and lead tomorrow's world. My name is Lydia Shapiro, and it's truly a pleasure to introduce to you Marina Kirkmar, our guest for today. Welcome to the show, Marina. Can you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, as you said, my name is Marina Kirkmar. I have been a professor. I got my PhD back in 1995 and have been a professor since then. So for a long time, and I always say that I've won the job lottery. I think the combination of teaching and research is really just a wonderful way to earn a living and engage with the world.
Fantastic. Is there anything specific that inspired you to focus your work on media?
Yeah, so I was interested in undergrad in communication, in journalism, in all fields related to media. And then when I got into graduate school, I really got more interested in not creating media, but the influence that media has on us. And as an undergraduate, I double majored with developmental psychology. And so it seemed to be a pretty good merge to study the influence of media on children and families and adolescents. And that is what I have spent my career doing.
So you've been a teacher for years, and I know that media is very prevalent on college campuses. Do you observe any specific challenges when talking about media with college students?
You know, I think that one of the challenges that I have anytime I talk about media is that it's so omnipresent and it's such a sort of lowbrow thing that people consume, or at least they think of it that way, that we assume it has no effects, right? We say, well, everyone else is influenced by media, but I'm not. I sort of know that, I know that when I'm being advertised to, that I know it's not accurate, or when I'm watching news, I'm watching it with a critical eye, and I know that when I'm being entertained, it's fictional. And yet everything we know about media effects research finds that none of that is actually true. So trying to get over that hurdle of convincing people that yes, in fact, media does have an influence on us, I think is one of the first things that we come up against.
Yeah, I was actually a psych major and I took your class, so I was learning about psych and media at the same time, and they definitely seem to be just so interconnected, and it's fascinating. That being said, do you have a favorite part of media?
Well, it sort of, varies over the years because media itself has changed so dramatically since I got my PhD back in the 1990s. And so one of the areas that I'm really interested in studying right now, especially as it relates to adolescents and families, is looking at social media, because obviously that is, if you are interested in adolescents, that is where they are being reached. And so I think I like doing research, not exclusively on social media, but doing research and teaching on the influence of social media. And I teach a class on social media effects.
Yeah, I actually took your class on social media effects, and I took it as a freshman. So going off of that, I was wondering how your college students' media habits might affect their communication in class or their academic performance.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we know is that depending on how we think about social media, it definitely influences how we sort of interact with the world. It has an influence on our ability to communicate clearly, to empathize with others. And depending on the content that you are consuming online, it can be a distraction. So a lot of people do what we now think of as media multitasking. And even if we are convinced that we do it well, we know from the research that we don't do it well. As a matter of fact, the better we think we are at it, usually the worse we are at it. And so sort of teaching students to think about media as something that they need to manage in their own lives, instead of having the social media manage them, I think is an important message that I want to convey. And one of the ways that I convey that is by first sort of laying out the research that says, hey, these are some of the positive things that it can do, and here are some of the negative things that it can do. And now you get to take charge of what you want to have happen.
Right. I think it all really comes into play with college students and multitasking and distractions. And I actually wrote an article on how media and technology has they've pushed us to multitask more because of our decreasing cognitive efforts and ability to concentrate, which really have been on the decline.
Yeah, it really has. And, social media is designed specifically to grab and keep our attention. So it is not necessarily our fault that it does the very thing that it is designed to do. And so we have to work really hard to make sure that, again, that we're in charge.
Right. So whether as a teacher or a researcher, do you have any upcoming projects that you're excited about?
Yeah, so I've got a couple of really things that I am definitely excited about. So one of the things that I have been working on, I have so many different ones, but I guess the two that I'll talk about since we're talking about social media is there's a lot of research on social media, but it's a really hard thing to figure out how to measure social media use. And so I've been working on several different projects where my colleagues and I are trying to figure out how best to measure social media use. Because simply measuring it like we used to think about it when it first came around, simply saying how much time do you spend on social media, that's not a very useful metric. So I have some projects related to coming up with the best measurement for how to kind of figure out how much and what kind of social media people are using. Related to what kind of influence it has. And then the other one that is really more related to my interest in kids and family is I am curious not just about social media, but about how kids and families of LGBTQ kids use media, both social media, things like TikTok, and narrative shows like Heartstopper that came out on Netflix, and how those families use media to talk about these issues with their kids, and sort of understanding that process, that media can really provide a benefit, but can also be a problem depending on how sort of parents engage with their LGBTQ kids and what their own attitudes are towards media and towards these issues. And so I really am interested in that project.
Oh, fascinating. That's so exciting.
Yeah.
As an educator, do you have any predictions of the future of education?
Yeah, I don't think I'm saying anything surprising when I say education has really changed a lot. And 2020, of course, just really forced us to be online. And so this shift that was happening anyway, with education moving into more online formats, kind of got sped up by that. And now what we need to do is we need to sort of take a step back and say, okay, how can we leverage the power of media to have education reach more people while still recognizing that just simply kind of throwing it online doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to get good education. So really thinking about how media can best be leveraged to improve education, I think, is one of the challenges that educators face. And I still believe in the power of, face-to-face education as well.
Yeah, so at my private professor, we're always trying to promote using technology for good, and how online learning has really opened the doors for more access to education. And it's just so interesting how COVID opened the doors for students and individuals to have access to educational resources that they might not have had otherwise.
Right, and doing it in a way that, there's research coming out now that tells us how can we best leverage media to educate. And there are better ways of doing it and less good ways of doing it. And I'm really hopeful about that.
Well, you mentioned 2020 and COVID, so I just wanted to shift for a second. I know you gave up having a television in your home years ago. So I was wondering, during COVID, did you have, those urges to get a peek into media? And how did you actually figure out how to entertain yourself?
Yeah, again, so there's been a huge shift in media. And I gave up television when my older kids were younger for a lot of different reasons. And it was easier to do then. Now that so much has shifted online, it really is a challenging thing. So I think that the way we need to think about it now is not that we need to give up media, screen media, but that we need to be very mindful and conscious of what we are consuming. So, like everyone else, my kids and I watched movies during COVID, but we also focused on, playing board games and reading and doing other things. So just trying to mix it up, not just to avoid screens because of some of the problems that are inherent in and can be inherent in screen media, but also because we wanted a variety of things to do. And so that's what we did.
Do you think that living without a screen affects your teaching methods and how you communicate with students?
Well, I should say that I no longer do that.
Okay.
We still don't have a television, but that's not the only way to kind of get that stuff anymore. It's, as a matter of fact, most people watch on screens that are not TVs. And so how has it affected me? Again, I'm just sort of mindful of how I use it and how I deliver it and how I consume it.
So based on your years of teaching and researching, what is the most significant piece of advice you'd give to students about their media habits?
Well, I like the fact that you use the term media habits, because it is very much that we all have media use habits. And we can have good habits, right? But the habit to, get up early and go to the gym, or the habit of eating healthfully. But habits can also be very problematic too. And I think overuse of media, and importantly, mindless use of media, can be really problematic. So what we need to do, and we find that things like mindless consumption of media really makes it so that we are not questioning what we see. We are not interacting with it in a way that might help us understand it. And so the best piece of advice I can give is be conscious of what you're consuming, the likely effects that it can have, and how you can best interact with it to monitor how much and what you are consuming. And I think from all of that, we can kind of harness the best of media for ourselves, but also make sure that the negative impacts are minimized.
Right. So really taking that extra step to be more conscious and more active in understanding your own habits.
Absolutely.
Great. So onto a bigger idea. In your opinion, what is the most important or pressing issue facing the education system in our country?
Oh my gosh, I think that would differ based on whether I was talking about, primary education or whether I was talking about university education. With university education, I would say that we are now educating a generation of kids who grew up online. And one of the challenges is teaching people to be critical thinkers. That has always been part of education, long before the internet came around. Teaching people to be critical thinkers was vital. It's part of the education process. It's even more important now when all of us are faced with a barrage of so much information, and we need to be able to work our way through that to discern what's accurate, what's valuable, what's credible, what can we trust and what can we not trust. So I think one of the greatest challenges of education right now is teaching people to be critical thinkers in a way that is even more important now that we are in the 21st century and dealing with so much screen media coming at us all the time.
Like you said, it seems so apparent that in any type of class, students will have this full force of media coming their way. So is there any recommendation you have for educators who are not specifically teaching media for encouraging healthy media habits?
Yeah, I think, part of it is encouraging healthy habits, which is really just sort of talking through. But I think that what comes before the healthy habits is teaching that critical thinking. And so, teaching media effects is just a vehicle for teaching critical thinking. And I think that critical thinking can be taught looking at all kinds of stuff and learning about all kinds of stuff. So teaching people to assess the evidence that's in front of them. A claim is being made. What is the evidence being presented, and what is the quality of that evidence? And that can be taught across the spectrum, regardless if you are a biologist or a chemist or a literary critic or a communication researcher. And I think most educators approach it that way.
Yes, I completely agree. I definitely think any educator can and should encourage just having awareness about the reality of media's prevalence in everyday life. Going off of that, do you have any suggestions for parents as to how to, outside of the classroom, encourage healthy media habits?
Yeah, well, one of the things that parents learn very quickly is that we teach kids by modeling. Like that is, we can talk at our kids all day, but essentially what we do is what they are going to do. So I think the best thing that we can do as parents in terms of teaching our kids good media habits is having good media habits ourselves. And then using opportunities to talk about things like, when we were consuming something together, what do you think that character meant by that? What was their motivation? Do you think that consequence was the right thing to have happen to them? Or do you believe this piece of information that we are listening to right now? Can we explore other ways to investigate whether or not that is true? So both modeling good media habits and then also using media as an opportunity to talk to your kids.
Right, definitely. Encouraging cognitive and critical thinking without shutting out the element of media.
Right, exactly. It's a great resource. It can be a great resource for parents to talk about these things with kids.
Absolutely. So in the classroom, when your students get stuck or frustrated trying to understand a concept around media, how do you help them get there?
I guess I do a lot of, I think, what's sometimes called the Socratic method. So asking questions and kind of leading them through the logic. And I would say that 75% of the time, if you ask the right questions, students will start to put things together themselves. Once in a while, I'll just have to come right out and say, no, what we're talking about here is this. But I think learning to ask good questions and sort of seeing where the conversation is going. I think a lot of being a good teacher is being a good moderator of discussion and moderator of ideas and knowing how to plant the ideas so that students are kind of led towards the right answer without me spoon feeding them that answer.
Right, and that kind of goes back to what you said about being a model for critical thinking when it comes to your own kids and how it's important to encourage asking questions and critical thinking in general. What's the most fun part of teaching media?
I don't know if it's the most fun part necessarily. I don't think I can talk about one specific thing, but I love it when students I'll talk about a couple of things very briefly. One is that when students start to make connections themselves and they come up with examples from their own lives that apply to something that we're talking about. I think that's very gratifying. The other thing that I find extremely gratifying is when students reach out to me from outside of class by email, or they'll stop me and say after class and say, I read something that kind of connected to something that we were talking about in class the other day, and realizing that they are thinking about it and applying it to their own lives outside of the classroom is maybe not fun, but just incredibly gratifying.
I appreciate that. When I took your class, I definitely had those moments. I remember doing the no phone challenge and definitely had lots of insights from that. What is the most important part of being an educator?
I think connecting with students. I don't think people can learn in an environment where they don't feel that their ideas are being heard, that they're being respected as individuals, and that they're able to make mistakes. And so I think the most important thing to me as an educator is creating a classroom environment that is education worthy, that is kind of a situation where people feel open to ideas, ready to discuss, ready to put themselves out there, ready to answer questions even if they're not sure that it's the right answer. I think that human connection is a vital part of education.
I love that. Cultivating a healthy classroom culture and environment is so important.
Absolutely.
So I just have one more big question about social media. We talked about how prevalent it is on college campuses and how much bigger of a force it's become. In your classroom, do you notice that prevalence amongst your students and how it might be kind of a distracting force in class?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I discourage students from using their laptop for anything other than taking notes. I remind them occasionally to do that. And honestly, before class, I will sometimes tell students, put away your phones. We've got 5 minutes. Talk to the person sitting next to you. And sometimes I'll be so direct as to say, all right, turn to the person next to you and ask them the following 3 questions, just to sort of while away the time when people are coming in. So I think that hopefully encourages not just mindfulness about our media use, but the fact that there are all these real live human beings outside of our screens, and that it is important to connect with them.
Great. So do you still do the no phone challenge with your students?
Oh, that is such a great exercise. Yes, I do that every time I teach social media effects. And I love that students come away from it with a lot of different insights. And I'm also always interested in how long they choose. And some students will choose to put away their phones for 2 hours. And some of them will choose to do it from, Friday to Monday morning. And they'll choose to do it for a much longer time. And I always find it interesting to just read their essays about that experience.
I definitely remember feeling and noticing that discomfort of not having a device, and then feeling uncomfortable about the fact that I was feeling uncomfortable about not having a device. And then that definitely allowed me to kind of reflect on my habits and look into why I was actually feeling unsettled. Right. I think that's a great project.
Yeah, and people report that a lot, that when they don't have their phones, they feel uncomfortable, they feel unsettled, which is an interesting idea if you think about it. Like, why is that?
Thank you so much for joining us today, Marina. It's been a pleasure, and I've loved getting to learn about your work in media and communications.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Lydia.